I'm very happy to speak with Mike Brcic today from Wayfinders. Mike is a fascinating entrepreneur, a lot of great lessons about scaling your business, developing systems and processes so that it runs on autopilot, and also making choices about your life and what you like in life, whether you want to sell your business or create a new one. Enjoy listening. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meaning podcast. I'm Eric Rosenberg, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Brcic. How do I pronounce your last name, Mike?
Yeah, Brcic.
Brcic. Yeah. Thank you. Mike is an amazing individual that I know thanks to Jason Gaignard and the fabulous MMT community. Mike has started Sacred Rights, that was nominated the first mountain bike tour operator on Earth from the National Geographic Adventure. He's now created Wayfinders. More important than anything else, he's a fabulous human being, and he's a fabulous entrepreneur who has been with probably almost everything any entrepreneur would go through in the roller coaster life of entrepreneurship. Mike, thank you for being with us today.
I'm so happy to chat with you today.
So there's so much to talk about, and you have so much experience. Let's start with one of your passion point, if I could say, is community, connections, and belonging, and especially the question, why does that matter, and how can we develop it for ourselves and our companies? Why community, connection, and belonging?
Well, I guess there's two answers. One is why it matters to me, and one is why I think it matters for the world. And why it matters to me, I guess, before we hit record, we were chatting a little bit about high school. And for me, high school was a pretty confusing, often lonely time. And even going back before that, to grade school, just this sort of ongoing sense that I didn't really fit in and had a hard time, finding my group, that kind of thing. And so it was a very isolating experience for me. And that's kind of, that feeling never quite went away. And in the last 5 years, particularly, but, even before then, I've definitely put a lot more energy into that space and gotten rid of some of my own hangups around that. And I have a wonderful network of friends and wonderful family. But that pain of isolation, I can still remember that, and I can still touch on that feeling very clearly. And so why this work matters to me and the work that I do, which, so much of what I do these days is about connecting people and helping people forge deep connections, is simply because of those formative experiences of how painful that is, particularly, when you're growing up and you're starting to develop your own independence and your parents aren't looking out for everything for you. And then it's a very common experience for preteens, teenagers to be very isolated. And that continues through adulthood. And so I don't want people to experience that. So that's why I do the work I do. And I guess, the second answer why this matters for everybody, and I've really, particularly over the last year, really been diving into the research around human connection. Mm-hmm. And all of the research basically says that human connection with another human being is one of our most fundamental needs. And our brains are completely wired for it. And so we have all these neurochemicals like oxytocin and dopamine and these other chemicals that are completely wired for connection. And if we don't have connection, if we feel lonely, if we feel isolated, it throws our whole system into stress mode. And the outcomes of that, for your health are terrible for our mental well-being, but also our physical well-being. So if you live a very connected life, the studies show that you are going to live significantly longer than people who are lonely and isolated. Mm-hmm. And you'll have greater levels of well-being. And so that's why it matters. And I think people need to be reminded of that, because it's easy to get lost in hustling and, chasing whatever career or other dream that we have. But all the research now backs up what we know to be inherently true, is that a meaningful life is one that's connected with other human beings. And that's what makes us thrive and feel good.
I always believe that. I'm glad to hear that there's research confirming it. Is there any research related to the sense of belonging of people in a company, in an organization. That there's the Latin term of affectio societatis, that you feel you belong to that and you're happy to belong to that. Is there any research linking the between bracket well-being or people happy to belong to an organization and the results of that organization?
Yeah, what's interesting you asked that. I was actually just looking at a study this morning around that topic, but probably the one that's most well-known and the easiest to point to is Google did a big study many years ago called Project Aristotle, and they wanted to discover, Google has thousands and thousands of teams working on all kinds of different projects, and they wanted to know what makes what makes teams the most productive. What are the factors that contribute to productive and successful teams? And they found the number one thing was psychological safety, which was this idea that you can trust your colleagues and they can trust you in return. And the best way to develop psychological safety is to help people create connections, because that's what builds trust. And so, as of late, that's a field that I'm getting into. I've been doing more facilitation work for companies, helping them build more connection and more psychological safety among their teams, which, for managers and for company owners, the benefit is more productivity, more loyalty, happier employees. But the benefit for the employees is that they feel that sense of belonging when they come to work. They feel loyalty to their colleagues and then consequently loyalty to the company. Mm-hmm. And if you can create that for people, and again, the research shows that this is sorely lacking in the world. People feel less belonging than ever before in our major institutions. Churches, synagogues, community groups. These are all on the decline, and so we don't have things to replace those. So if you can create that for people at work, it is transformative and has massive ripple effects.
That's fascinating. So you say it's the Project Aristotle from Google?
Project Aristotle, that was the Google study. Yeah.
And I suppose that if we Google that Google study, we would find it.
Yeah, you shouldn't have too much trouble finding that.
And so number one factor, psychological safety. Very interesting, especially when you see how much people can spend their time trying to undermine each other in the organization. That's very interesting study.
To say, like, psychological safety, it's this sort of nebulous term. Like, what does that really mean? A lot of that, basically it just means, can I bring myself, my authentic self, to the workplace and still feel safe to do that? And workplaces where there isn't that same level of psychological safety, people have to really be cautious about what they say, about how they act. They don't feel like they can bring themselves to work, right? Mm. And so when you can create that safety, it's like you're giving people permission to drop the mask that they have to wear or the armor. And for myself personally, I know that when you walk around in life wearing a mask or being armored up psychologically, it's exhausting, and it's hard to be a productive employee when you have to do that day in, day out.
Absolutely, yeah, I confirm that. Is that the reason why you started your company in an early age and said, you know what, I'm never going to find what I'm looking for, and so I'm starting my own company?
Well, my first company, that was 1996, so it's a little bit hard to place myself in the shoes of that young, crazy man. I do know that I graduated my university the year before, and the day after my last exam, I piled all my things into my Volvo station wagon, and I drove up to the mountains, and I said, I'm going to be a ski bum, and then I'll figure out real life. And I promptly got fired from my first 3 jobs.
The first 3? Wow.
First 3, yeah. I think the first one lasted about a month. The second one was about 2 months. And then the third one was about 3 weeks. And so after a little bit of soul searching, I came up with the radical conclusion that I was a terrible employee and that I needed to start my own company. And really looking back then, and this was also, a friend of mine influenced that decision. I was going for a walk and I was a little bit down on myself, like, I just got fired from my 3rd job in a few months. Now what? And he said, we live in this beautiful town and there's all these amazing mountain bike trails here, and there's more and more people coming, more and more tourists coming. Why don't you show people around? And I thought that sounded like a crazy idea, but also a great idea. And within a few weeks, I had my first loan, and the business was born. And really, it was looking at how can I earn a living doing something I love. And I had a partner back then. We had a very slow start, one customer in our first year, but that one customer, I took him out biking for the day, and it was such an incredible experience. I couldn't believe somebody was giving me actual money, dollar bills, to go take them mountain biking, and I was spending my day on my mountain bike in the Canadian Rockies, and that was how I earned my money, and so that was all the spark I needed, and I've kind of tried to follow that rule, do things that light me up, and do it with heart and do it with integrity, and people will hopefully seek you out, and that's been the case. And
is that how you started Sacred Rides?
Yeah. Well, Sacred Rides, it was originally called Fernie Fat Tire Adventures because we were based in the town of Fernie, British Columbia. About 10 years into it, my partner was long gone by then. I started offering international trips, in Peru and in Croatia and Slovenia, all over the world. And so it didn't make any sense to have a company name that was tied to a particular small town. So it was rebranded Sacred Rides, and I grew that company all over the world. And we had about 60 staff all over the world, and we were ranked number one mountain bike tour operator on Earth by both National Geographic Adventure and Outside Magazine. And it was amazing. It was an amazing experience and an amazing ride, pardon the pun. But after 23 years, I decided it was time to move on. So I sold the company in February of 2019.
So you started almost by total serendipity, not with a plan or this is what I want to do in my life, but just loving it. And then finally finding the path while you're doing it. You were growing to 60 people all over the world. You were very successful. You're selling it. So it's like the North American, because you're Canadian, I was going to say the American dream, but the North American dream. And then you said, scaling is usually the path to misery. What happened?
Yeah. So if I look back to the early days of the company, and the early days, I sort of think back to those first 10 years in British Columbia, and we were operating trips throughout the interior of British Columbia. I was the lead guide. I was head chef. I was head driver, marketing department, sales, everything. It was very hands-on. And so, my summers, particularly when we were getting busier and we were running back-to-back trips from mid-June to mid-September, I was on my bike every single day. When I wasn't leading customers, I was out there exploring and finding new routes. And it was hard, and it was stressful, and it was hard on my body. But it was, it was magical. It was, I look back very fondly at that time. And then I started growing the company internationally, as I mentioned. And that was a blast because I was going to Peru and I was going to, all these places around the world and scouting things out. And then, and that was going very well for a few years. But then in 2013, I decided I was impatient with our growth and I wanted to scale it. I wanted to scale it even more, even though we'd been averaging almost 50% growth for years before that. I wanted it to grow even bigger. And I set this goal that we were going to be in 150 countries by 2021. And so I raised money from investors, and then I did it again in 2014, and then I did it again in 2016. And I hired lots of people. I spent lots of money. We expanded. We expanded by 2017, we were in 45 additional destinations. Huh. So we were well on our way to hitting that crazy target. And, it was everything that I had planned and dreamed about. And it was making me miserable because I was working, harder than ever. I wasn't guiding trips anymore. I was, writing shareholder reports. I was looking at spreadsheets all day. I was putting out fires all the time. And because it had become a very big, complex company. And I thought, more and more, I started thinking back to those early days where I was on my mountain bike. I was with my customers. I was seeing the joy that they were getting out of it, and realized, eventually that this was not. And when I first started feeling all that stress and started feeling more and more miserable about it, I thought, well, maybe the solution is to throw more gas on the fire. Scale even more rapidly. Once we hit this target, then I'll feel good about it, or something like that. And eventually I realized that was madness, and that no amount of scale was going to, fill this hole in my heart or whatever. And I actually intentionally scaled down the company, and I implemented lots of systems and processes so I could remove myself from the company and regain my life back. And and haven't looked back since. And I'll never. I don't think I'll ever run a company the same way.
Fascinating.
I may scale, but I won't. I don't feel the same need to have to. Have to be in every country on earth and be on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. And, I just realized that those were all vanity goals and a need for validation. It was my ego at play, and realized that wasn't a healthy way to approach a company or a life.
How did you do that? What happened from the moment you say enough to the moment you were almost on autopilot and building all those systems and processes? How did you do that, and how long did it take?
Well, the first step was really coming to terms with why this was happening, and realizing that so much of it was being driven by my ego. And when I looked, when I started looking at all these goals and targets I'd set, and asking the question why, and then sometimes asking why a few more times, and going a little bit deeper, I couldn't come up with any really good and meaningful reasons why any of these things were meaningful, or at least meaningful to me. This was like, for several years, our BHAG, our big, hairy, audacious goal, was to be in 150 countries. And this was like, it was all over the office. It was like every communication, this is what we were going to hit. And I started looking at that goal and realizing, like, why on earth is that meaningful? I don't feel any sort of emotional or spiritual resonance with that. It's just like some vanity project. And so the first step was realizing that, and then getting comfortable with the idea that I didn't need to have that. So, just to walk you through a little bit of the process, that, and this is so typical of growing companies, they scale themselves out of business because, the revenues might be going up like crazy, but expenses are going up even more crazily. And so they're gradually or sometimes quickly growing themselves out of business. And that was very much the case with us. Our revenues were going gangbusters, but expenses, I'd added so many people and we were spending so much money. And then when you have investor money, you've got all this money sitting in the bank, and you don't even really have to worry about the business fundamentals. So it's like, I glanced at our income statement once a year when our accountant prepared, and I didn't give it any attention. So first thing was, we needed to become a profitable company, and we needed to become very cash flow positive. So I actually, we raised our prices by around 30%, because I realized that I wanted to be in the high margin, low volume game. And our margins were too low. I reduced our operating expenses by around 40%, which some of it was, I just went through our income statement line by line, everything on there. And some of it was really easy. It was like, we were spending crazy amounts of money on software. And then I started looking at the credit card statements, and then I'd look at, there's a piece of software on there, and I'd ask the team, have any of you ever used this software? And they're like, nope, never heard of it. And it's like, most of it was traced back to me, right? It's like, oh, this looks cool. And then, I'll spend $200 a month on this thing or whatever. So a lot of that stuff was easy to get rid of. I had 2 developers that were building all sorts of bells and whistles for our technologies constantly. And I realized, like, we don't need to do that. So I moved to 1 half-time developer. And then I ended up having to, I did some layoffs. I had to lay off my operations director. I moved somebody else to half-time. And just, I had to make some tough decisions. And, by the end of it, the company was profitable. Our cash flow was good. And then I started looking at all the things that all the things that were stressing me out besides the cash flow. So I was constantly putting out fires. People were always bringing issues to me. So I implemented this thing I called an issues list, which is if you've got an issue, and if it's going to break the company, then bring it up with me right away. Otherwise, put it in the issues list. And then once a week, the core team would meet and we would look at these issues and we would figure out what is the actual root cause of this issue, rather than just putting a Band-Aid on it. What's actually happening, deeper down. And then we would discuss it and we would come up with a plan to solve it. And once it was solved for good. So that was a huge one for us. And then the other big thing was just looking at, like, what do I do on a weekly basis? What are the things that I do every week? How do I spend my time? And then after documenting all of that, I went through each of them and said, do I want to keep doing this? Do I want to automate it? Do I want to delegate it? Or do I want to outsource it? And then I would figure out a plan. And so by the end of that process, it was about 7 months from start to finish. So the start of it was me pulling my hair out and losing my mind. And the end of it was me doing 2.5 hours of meetings on Thursdays with my core team. And that was it for my responsibilities. And
that was it.
That was it. And the company thrived without me. And that was both a testament to the systems and processes we put in place, and maybe to the fact that I was just meddling too much in the business, and it would do better without me.
That's very interesting. And I'm thinking of all my colleagues, and I was guilty of that as well in the past when I had my own corporate events company, thinking that, I could delegate, but nobody would do it as best as I could. Or I like to do it.
That's so common. We think we're the only one who can do something.
Exactly.
Do it well.
Exactly. And by removing yourself from the day-to-day of the logistical part, you can then focus on your customer, on growing your customer base, on looking at different ways to grow the company or do something else. But you basically have the time to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I look at it as, as a CEO or an owner, your time should be spent in only a few areas. And that's, the culture of the company, establishing a great culture. And, a lot of that is just connecting with your employees and making sure they're connecting with each other. You are responsible for the strategy and the vision of the company. And maybe you're responsible for, a few key big contracts, but even that, isn't necessarily CEO work. And then beyond that, the things, maybe a few things that you just really love to do. But beyond that, other people should be doing that, or you should automate it or stop doing things altogether. Mm-hmm. And when you can do that and free up your headspace to do the types of things that an owner or CEO should do, the big picture type of stuff and the things that you love to do, that the results are remarkable because your energy isn't drained by all this other stuff. And for me, like anything to do with financial stuff and, invoices and paying our suppliers and, whatever, all that stuff just drained me. And whenever I did it, it would just suck all my energy out and I could barely do other things. Mm. Right. And so when I started freeing up that time, it meant that I could spend some time in developing a partnership with a company that I really wanted to work with. And so, I'm doing work that I could hire a bookkeeper $40 an hour, $30 an hour to do, instead of doing work that, if I actually calculate, back then, if I actually calculated the value of my time when I'm working on those bigger projects, like if I'm writing a proposal for a partnership and I'm spending the time to, have lunch with the owner of that company or something like that, that might be that time I might invest 20 hours and that might be $250,000 a year contract. Right. Mm. So that's,
good investment.
It's like over $10,000 an hour work, right? Yeah. Versus bookkeeper work. And so many entrepreneurs, they just think, well, I just have to do it. I can't afford. There are always things there's so many things you can't afford not to get off your plate, because if they're draining your energy because you hate doing it or you're bad at it or whatever, you're going to become very ineffective as
absolutely. That's one of my favorite exercises actually when I'm coaching people in our industry is really what is it that you're doing, and then what is it that you should be doing, or want to do it, what is it that you are going to delegate, and what you're going to stop doing, because quite frankly it doesn't mean anything or it's not important in the development of the company. So you're developing that company, you put it on autopilot, it's running on autopilot. Why did you decide then to sell it?
Yeah, so it ran like that for about 6 months. and
Okay.
things were going smoothly. But I ultimately, at that point, and that was 2018. At that point, I was 22 years into it, and I just realized I had done everything I would want to do with that company, and that even though I wasn't working in it very much, I didn't really have the same love for it as I once did. I wasn't. It didn't really excite me. It felt like a remnant from a previous chapter in my life that I'd kind of held on to a little bit too long, and that I was now in a different phase in my life, and that I wanted new professional challenges. And even though I wasn't working very, very hard in it, I didn't feel like I could really step into something new without moving beyond that. So I ended up hiring a broker. The process, start to finish, was I think about 14 months. And selling a company, I discovered, was almost a full-time job in itself. It's a big job.
Or buying one is the same.
Yeah, exactly. And it took, because the company had been growing so fast, I didn't pay attention to things like my minute book and my governance documents and proper paper trails for everything, whatever. There was tons of work just to clean up all of that mess and get it prepared for a seller, and then all the due diligence documents and all that kind of stuff. Countless meetings with people. It was a big job, but the beauty is once I did find a seller, because the company was so turnkey, because I didn't really have any responsibilities, I was able to sell it and then get out of there lightning quick. I was free and clear within 4 weeks, and because the owner was like, well, you don't actually do anything in this company, so I don't need you around. And so, I have friends who've sold their companies and they have like a 2-3 year earnout where they've got to hustle and grind to hit certain targets so that they can get paid, the last 50% of their company. I don't know anybody that has enjoyed that process, because, you spend, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years building a business, and all of a sudden somebody else is telling you what to do, and you maybe disagree with them, but it's not your say anymore. And, everybody I know who's gone through that process hates it. So, my goal was to get out of there as quickly as possible and just get out.
Got it. Congratulations again. Is that those 17 months the moment where you start thinking about what's next and come up with the idea of Wayfinder? Or is it something that get into your mind after you sold the previous company?
Well, I'd actually started the company before. So I did my first event in September of 2017. And again, because I was very cautious, I didn't want to repeat the same mistakes that I did with the previous company. So my objective from the get-go was 2 events a year, put lots of energy and focus into making them really incredible events, but don't do more than 2 a year. And so as I was, winding my way out of Sacred Rides, I was starting to work on the new company, and that hasn't really changed since selling Sacred Rides. I didn't look at that as like, oh, now I've got free time, I can do 10 events a year. I've always looked at it as, how can I provide maximum value to a small group of people, my customers, and make a comfortable living for myself and work as little as possible. Because there's so many other things that I want to do, including spending time with my family and writing and riding my bike and all these other kind of things. Yeah. And I realized, one of the things that I realized was that too often we fall into the trap of thinking that we have to find our purpose and our meaning through work. And I realized that work wasn't the only place where I needed to find or where I could find purpose and meaning. There was a lot of purpose behind becoming a great father, becoming the best husband I could be, in my relationships with my friends and customers. And so I realized I didn't have to put all my eggs in this work basket. And I think, particularly in the West, we put all the we put the quest for meaning and purpose squarely at the feet of our companies, where that's just one place where we can find it. Yeah. And we don't need to just, go all out in our companies like, this is where I'm going to find my purpose. There's so many other ways to find that. And so I have, from the early days of Wayfinders, approached it from the perspective of, this is one area where I can find a lot of fulfillment and joy, but it's not the only one. And I don't need to repeat the same mistakes I did before and just keep scaling this, and because that's going to compromise the other things that are meaningful and important.
And if I'm not mistaken, Wayfinder, so you create unique experiences, not specifically with biking, but unique experiences in the world, and helping people that are going into those adventure to create a life of deep alignment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, ultimately the goal with the events is to create an environment where people can connect on a deeper level than they might have anywhere else before in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
I take these people, the entrepreneurs, and I take them to these crazy places like Greenland or Bhutan or the far reaches of the Amazon, and we have these crazy fun experiences and adventures in these places. But really, that is just creating a container for deep connection. And then I also do these facilitations and exercises that help people connect with their peers and on deeper levels than they might have ever before with anyone. Mm-hmm. And so and what I've experienced is that if I can do that, it is transformative for people, because they have a place where they can talk about anything with other people, their struggles and their challenges and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And then in the process, it helps them. And then in the process, exposing them to these other cultures and alternative worldviews, where, it might be learning from indigenous people in the Amazon, or might be spending time at a remote monastery in Bhutan. And in the process of being exposed to that different perspective and that different worldview, it causes people to maybe think about the life that they're living, and maybe incorporating some of this other wisdom into how they view the world.
Fabulous.
And it's very easy for us entrepreneurs to just keep charging ahead, and we don't really make time for these questions. And I know you were talking about, Yom Kippur is typically a day of reflection for you.
Yep.
And I think that's super important, to just set aside time to reflect, because if we're always just going pedal to the metal, we're not really stopping to question, is this, am I on the right road? Am I driving the right car? Are the right people in the car with me? We're just like gunning the gas and going without questioning any of that. So I think that's really important. That's a big part of why I do what I do.
Totally concur with that. And, we both agree relationships are essential for life, including for business. And we don't really take the time to just stop and really thinking, am I having authentic relationship with the people? Is it fulfilling for me? What am I giving to them? So that's great to have moment. And you don't have to fast once a year to go and pray to do that. But it's a good moment to take time and reflect on that. Absolutely.
Well, now, you're at least you're not busy with making food.
Yeah, right.
Or eating food. There's more time to reflect. Food takes up so much time in our lives.
Absolutely. Although cooking is also an activity that focuses your mind on something else, and you never know. But absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time today. There's a lot of golden nuggets in everything you said, and reflecting on what we do, and very inspiring story. As I said at the beginning, we know each other from MMT, thanks to Jason Gaignard. And I need to finish this conversation with Jason's question, which is my favorite question. When we meet in 1 year with a bottle of champagne, what will we be celebrating?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you'd asked me this question, a week ago, my wife and I are talking about purchasing a property for the purposes of developing a retreat center.
Yeah,
and we've had some, and this has been our goal for a while, and we've had some deep conversations about this recently, and life is pretty good right now. We're in a pretty good place. And after, the stress of raising young children and building businesses and selling business, whatever, we're in a place where we can really just slow down and relax and enjoy each other. And so we're not entirely sure. And I'm not sure if I would give that answer, that that's what we'd be celebrating. I think we'd be, I would give maybe a little bit more boring answer. Just we're really celebrating life together and feeling, more connected and more more joy and more happiness and meaning as a family, and more connection with the people around us. And I'm less and less these days focused on goals, as I am more just about a process of becoming the person I want to be, and being in a state that I want to be in. So what we'd be celebrating is just another few steps down that journey.
Well, if that's a boring answer, I'll take boring answer anytime. Thank you so much, Mike. How do people get in touch with you? I know you have a newsletter. I know you're creating all those amazing adventure. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, the Wayfinders website is way-finders.com. That's probably the best spot. I have a blog on there that I write on regularly, and that's as good a place as any.
So way-finders.com.
That's the one.
I'm just translating for the Belgian people who would be listening to this conversation.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Mike, for sharing your story with me today. Fascinating how you develop your business, scale it, put it on autopilot, and then find another wayfinder to continue in your life. Thanks again for all the advices. If you want to join us on the Facebook group, www.eventbusinessformula.com/group. If you are a business owner in this industry, or if you are in the meetings and event industry, where we can share experiences, advice, and new ideas. And you can always connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you.